Hey guys, so I am super excited for this talk with Gommaar and Henning from WODScience. We are releasing a new program together, and this time we are focusing on strength. And luckily, I have these two guys here who I get to ask all my questions to, so they can take us through the why behind what we are doing. Maybe we start a little intro. Gommaar, do you want to give the people out there a little intro to yourself and your background?
Yes, of course I can. Thank you, John, for the introduction. So I'm Gommaar. I'm born and raised in Belgium, but now live in Switzerland. I am an exercise scientist, so I did my studies in Belgium, studied exercise sciences, also did my PhD where I investigated the effects of high altitude on muscle mass. So I've always been interested in the gain and loss of muscle mass via external factors such as hypoxia, so the loss of, the altitude, but also how resistance training affects muscle mass. So 4.5 years ago, I moved to Switzerland, where I'm doing now a postdoc, also related to the effects of different amino acids and how these amino acids are sensed by the muscle. I am a very big sports fanatic, and I've always been interested in different types of sports. And I have been doing CrossFit now for around 6 years, not very competitive, but at least at a decent level. And I'm really liking CrossFit because it's such an interesting sport from a physiological point of view. You do all kinds of different exercises that could also interfere with each other, strength training, endurance training. So from an exercise background, this is a very cool and interesting sport to do, but also to research. So that's a little bit my background.
Perfect. And Henning, can you please let the world know about yourself?
Absolutely, John. Thanks. Yeah, so I did my PhD in Berlin, Germany, on changes in metabolism in skeletal muscle with congenital muscular dystrophies. So I'm not that directly connected to exercise, but I've done my undergrad in exercise physiology, and I've done my master's in exercise physiology in Maastricht, where we actually have conducted a bunch of studies on protein metabolism with exercise and aging. So these are, I think, interesting topics that maybe Gommaar will go into a little more detail later on when he answers some questions on protein intake, for example, in conjunction with resistance exercise. So I'm definitely interested in the subject as well, also from a investigative point of view. But over the last couple of years, I've been a little more on the clinical side with my own research, which doesn't mean that I personally wouldn't still engage in CrossFit or those types of exercise. And yeah, I've started in, I think, 2010, 2011. So a little more on the earlier side in terms of Europe, obviously not in comparison to the US, but been around for a while, have competed in a couple of smaller and bigger competitions, and still enjoy following the community and trying to apply our knowledge about skeletal muscle on exercise. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that. And we are going to dive into the questions now. So the first question I have is regarding protein intake. And it kind of over to you, Gommaar, like how much protein is needed to support training during this period, say, for example, during the 8-week strength program that we're going to be doing?
Yes, John. Thank you for that question. I will just share a PowerPoint, some slides that make it a little bit more visual for the viewers. I guess you can see this, right? So so this is an overview study where many studies have been actually put together in a meta-analysis, it's called. And what did it show? It actually showed that if you look at on the x-axis is the daily protein intake. So it's not about, this is not about protein quality or protein or which kind of protein, plant-based or animal-based. It's just total protein intake compared to the lean mass gains, so the muscle mass gains while doing resistance training. And all the dots here are individual points, studies. So you can see that if the protein intake is actually increasing in the amounts under 1.6 gram per kilogram, then you also, on average, also increase lean mass gains with doing resistance training. But interestingly, after a certain amount of protein per day, this effect plateaus. So it is generally stated that if you consume around 1.6, 1.7 gram per kilogram per day during your whole training period, you should be on the safe sides related to gains in muscle mass. So this is one of the things we usually also recommend to athletes. Try to eat around 1.6 grams per kilogram. It's not that little. You really have to work for it, at least for some people. So it might make sense to write down how much protein you actually eat for a couple of days, and then see where you come in terms of total protein intake. So maybe some other people will also have some other questions related to maybe the protein quality. So here is a very recent study, actually published, I think, 3 days ago. Also a meta-analysis where they listed all the different studies looking at the effect of protein quality on the lean mass gain, so the same muscle mass gains during strength training. And here you see a forest plot, meaning that all the my mouse is gone. All the studies that showed a positive effect related to high quality protein, so favors high. This is on the right side, meaning that the most of the studies that provided the participants high quality protein, meaning animal-based protein containing a lot of BCAAs, so mostly animal-based protein. There's also some exceptions in plant-based protein. In younger and also older people actually yielded the best results. So the protein quality per se is also an important factor here. Certainly when you cannot actually get to the 1.6 gram per kilogram daily. So
just to Gommaar, that's alluding to so kind of to summarize that in a quick way, but the animal protein is shown to be more effective than taking like soy-based protein or whatever
certainly if you are eating, so this is also what the study showed, if you are consuming the same amount. So if you're consuming suboptimal or maybe just optimal 1.4, 1.5 gram per kilogram, and you only eat soy-based protein, then you are probably not getting all the positive benefits, positive effects. But if you then, that's also, it's not really shown here, but if you would consume more lower quality protein, then you will actually get the same amount or same effects than animal-based protein. That's actually now pretty well established, at least for the last couple of years. And I will try to explain you why this is. Quickly, so the most important amino acids, at least related to anabolism, or one of the most important, is leucine. So it's an individual amino acid, and amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So you consume a whole protein source, it will be digested to peptides and single amino acids. And this amino acids, one of them is leucine. And why it is generally accepted that animal-based proteins are probably higher in quality and can also stimulate muscle mass to a higher extent is because if you consume such animal-based proteins, such as, for example, whey, this is the black line here, you see that the leucine in the plasma will be spiking 30 minutes, 60 minutes after consumption of your shake. And it has to spike above a certain threshold to trigger anabolism or to trigger the synthesis of new proteins. If you would do, for example, the same with soy or with casein, the spike in leucine is a bit less. Why? And that's why you also won't get the maximal effects, because you don't actually get towards the leucine trigger or the leucine trigger hypothesis here. So this is what generally is seen. What you could do is, for example, eat much more of the soy-based protein, so you actually get the correct amount of leucine in the blood, that triggers the anabolic response. So that's why you could eat a bit more of the lower quality proteins. And this is one of the end slides, let's say the summary slides of our ebook about protein supplementation and the gains with resistance training. And what you can see here is that if you look at the pyramid, like what is the most, let's say, important, it will always be the total daily intake. So if you are sitting around 1.2 to 2 grams, a pretty wide range, but let's say around 1.6 gram per kilogram per day, you probably don't have to worry too much about the source and also not the distribution when you actually eat the proteins. If you really want to look at the details, you could, for example, distribute your protein intake every 3 hours to get the absolute maximal effects. But again, these are rather details. And here you can read one of the more detailed summary. So after a workout, you should consume around 0.3 to 0.5 gram per kilogram of high quality protein source. So that's for most people 20 to 30 grams of protein. With a certain amount of leucine, you can find that on the package. The time sensitivity is not super important, meaning that if you eat your protein before, during, or after your session, it probably doesn't matter too much. Animal-based, as I said, it doesn't really matter if you, or plant-based, if you consume a substantial or sufficient amount of proteins. And here per day, as I said, 1.2 to 2 gram per kilogram. Leucine content on the total day is not really known, but it has to be pretty substantial. And the timing, most people do 3 to 5 servings of high quality protein per day. That will be optimal for your supporting your effects of resistance training.
Just what would we expect to see? I mean, let's say we didn't go to the extremes of protein deficiency, but let's say someone is just eating, say, half under that daily intake. How would we expect that to affect performance?
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to exactly know immediately how much performance will be affected. It is more a gradual, let's say, dampened increase in performance over time. If you would substantially eat for multiple weeks suboptimal amount of protein. Because you have to think that if you do resistance training, so purely the contractions of the muscle are very anabolic per se as well, without any protein. So people who do resistance training but eat submaximal amount of protein will still be far better off than people who maybe eat optimal amounts of protein but don't actually do a lot of resistance training, you see? So the anabolic effect of resistance training per se, it's much larger, I can affirm, much larger than just the protein source or the plant-based source or the animal-based source of your protein that you ingest. And that's what many people often forget. The training is king in this case.
But do you want to come in there, Henning?
Yeah, just to add maybe to that, I would fully agree with Gommaar that the training is the more important stimulus and that the protein intake is more of a facilitator. That's the way I think you should think of it. And being suboptimal for a day or even for a few days probably doesn't matter in the great scheme of things. But what we know is that if you have a suboptimal amount of protein for a prolonged time, then your gains, so the change in muscle mass or the change in strength with a certain program is slightly diminished.
Yes.
That's the only thing that could happen. You will still make progress, as Gommaar has outlined, but the progress will be a little less pronounced if you don't hit your macro goals, so to say.
Okay. So is there anything else you wanted to go over on the protein?
I think that's
I think one thing that everyone wants is a fast track to gains and success.
Yep.
And the supplement company world, I think, is one world that promises that. And as we know, with marketing, advertising, all these things. But from a scientific viewpoint, evidence-based viewpoint, what supplements should people be looking at taking in order to get the most strength benefits following this program?
Yes. So thank you, John, for that question. Of course, indeed, the supplement company is a multi-million-dollar business, and it's growing every year by 5 to 6
in there already.
Yeah, billion business, and it's growing by 5 to 6% per year. So it's really big, and there's a lot of marketing. And interestingly, there's not that much actually working products, I would say. So we screened the literature. There's a lot of noise in the literature, but we screened the literature and we tried to come up with a couple that are known and actually shown to have some performance benefits. And just because it's the first, but here I will start with beetroot juice. So that's an interesting one, because beetroot juice, we'll think about what the hell beetroot juice? Actually, beetroot juice contains a lot of nitrates, and it are the nitrates that have the ergogenic effect. So it has been shown that supplementing beetroot juice in literally 500 milliliter bottles or concentrated forms can increase the mostly endurance exercise and also high intensity exercise. So related to CrossFit could be interesting in an acute manner, meaning you have to consume it on the day of competition, but also 4 to 5 days you could already start building up the increased nitrate. So the mechanism of action is a little bit more biochemical, so I won't go too much into detail, but the nitrate is converted into nitrite, and that is converted into nitric oxide in the body, and that has some positive effect on mitochondrial efficiency, meaning that you actually need a little bit less oxygen for the same amount of power production from oxidative sources. So with less oxygen, you can actually generate the same amount of power output, which is beneficial, of course, for aerobic endurance exercise. So that is pretty well established. There are many papers starting from 12 to 15 years ago investigating this. And then you also have some maybe better knowns, that is beta-alanine. Beta-alanine is an amino acid, and it is the rate-limiting, say, amino acids for the synthesis of carnosine. And carnosine is an interesting one because it buffers the lactic acid in the muscle. So if certainly for resistance exercise, but also for CrossFit movements, there's a high buildup of lactic acid, and you feel that in the muscle, the muscle burn. But this carnosine, together with beta-alanine, can actually buffer this lactic acid, not production, but at least the effects of lactic acid. And therefore, you can actually push a little bit longer and a little bit more for, let's say, a couple of seconds, a couple of minutes. So that is a supplement that has also been well researched and shown to have some 2 to 3% performance benefits. So here we have to load the muscle. So one of the doses should be around 2 to 5 grams a day for around 30 days, 20 to 30 days before the competition. Then caffeine, of course, caffeine makes you a little bit more alert, and it can improve, therefore, acutely performance by just taking it on the day, or let's say 1 to 2 hours before the actual competition starts. So that's well known in the forms of coffee, but maybe better is to go for tablets, because it's a pretty high concentration here, 3 to 6 milligram per kilogram. So that's 180 to 250 milligrams for a normal person. So that's pretty high. That's quite some coffees. So I would go for tablets here. Or chewing gum is also a possibility. And then, of course, creatine, also known as the poor man's steroids. Creatine, the mechanism of action is a little bit difficult to explain, because it's not really exactly known how it comes that creatine is so beneficial, but it has to do with the creatine phosphate system. So maybe some people following the page, the WODScience page, have known that if you want to generate a lot of energy in a very short amount of time, so the first, let's say, 6 to 7 seconds of full blast energy production, for example, a clean and jerk or a very short sprint, this is because of the hydrolysis of creatine phosphate. And if you can actually improve or increase the stores of creatine phosphate in the muscles, you can improve performance in that way, and mostly in short exercises such as resistance training, for example. Here again, you have to load the muscle by, for example, the first 3 to 4 days, really loading the muscle by ingesting 20 grams per day, and then tapering off to 2 to 3 grams per day. You could also just start by a lower dose for a little bit longer period of time. So 2 to 3 grams per day for 40 days approximately. And then you have the second buffer, let's say the lactic acid buffer, which excuse me, which is a bicarbonate. And in contrast to carnosine and beta-alanine, bicarbonate is a blood buffer, let's say. So it buffers the lactic acid or the acid production outside the muscle in the blood. So it makes the blood more. It can actually buffer the lactic acid production that comes from the muscle in the blood, and that is bicarbonate. So it's a very cheap product that you can also ingest acutely. What is the problem here is that people often experience problems with the stomach, gastrointestinal problems, because it contains a high amount of sodium. So in that case, you have to really test it and feel if your body can cope with it. But that is also one of the things that could actually improve performance on competition day, this bicarbonate. And then there's a couple others that we don't really want to talk about now, because it's more in the gray zone, and the evidence of performance benefits are not really well established. So we can always go into more detail in the Q&A later.
Okay, perfect. So I want to take something over to you now, Henning, and feel free to kind of go this as you will. But it's looking at if endurance training can start to interfere with strength training, and how the two can either positively or negatively benefit each other.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the big questions that a lot of people have when it comes to the combination of endurance and strength training. Do they somehow impair each other, or can you basically reap the best of both worlds at the same time? I hope you can see the slides.
Yeah, we've got them up.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, so just as a very basic disclaimer here, obviously those are very complex subjects that a lot of people have done a lot of research on, and I'm sure we won't be able to do this perfect justice in those couple of minutes, but I'll try to give you an overview of what the evidence out there says, and give some conclusions for our subscribers there. Okay, so as for the background of these questions, essentially in the early 80s, there was a study that just looked at the effect of running, squatting, and the combination of running and squatting on the strength gains with exercise over a 10-week period. And what they found in this classic study is that, let me come up with a PowerPoint in here. What they found there was that if you only do the strength training, so if you only squat, I think it was twice a week, your strength increases to a certain extent, and most people came from an average of around 100 kilos to 140 kilos in the back squat. Now, if you combine that with running. So you did 2 times running per week and 2 times of squatting per week, then those gains were less pronounced, and the people started at a lower baseline, so maybe like at around 90 kilos, 85 kilos, and only made it up to a bit over 100 kilos. So the percent increase is still significant here. So people still increase their strength, but just not to the same extent that the people in the strength training only group did. Then if you compare that to just endurance training, the gains were even more diminished, or there were really no net gains compared to the starting level. So maybe they did an back squat here of around 83, 85 kilos. And here in the end, it's been maybe 84. So that's not a significant difference. So what this means is that based on this classic study from the early 80s, if you do only strength training, your strength will increase to a greater extent than if you combine your strength training with running. And if you do only running, your strength doesn't increase. Now, we think that there is a molecular basis for this effect called the interference effect. And, those are a bunch of well-researched molecules in the exercise physiology world. I don't need any of our subscribers to, know all these by heart or know what they do. They just have to understand that if you exercise, you're causing certain molecular signals in your muscle that cause certain cascades of interaction with other molecules that then cause either an increase in, for example, translation initiation, so the creating of new proteins, protein synthesis if you want, or the decrease, depending on what kind of stimulus you exhibit with your training. And what this graphic here shows is that if you do endurance training, that's what this little bicycle here is supposed to mean. If you do endurance training, you turn on signals such as AMP kinase phosphorylation, which then causes a decrease in mTORC1 activity. And we know that mTORC1 is one of the major molecules that regulates cell growth and eventually also muscle growth. So muscle growth and remodeling, that's something that is highly correlating with mTORC activity, at least initially with exercise. And what we can see here in this graphic is basically that that endurance training is thought to turn on AMPK, which in turn inhibits mTORC1. So you get a decrease in translation initiation, a decrease in protein synthesis. And at the same time, what the cycling also does is it not only decreases protein synthesis, but it also increases protein breakdown by activating those proteins that are involved in the ubiquitin proteasome pathway. So overall, we have a decrease in protein synthesis and an increase in protein breakdown, causing this inhibition of the muscle fiber growth that we usually see with strength training if you add in cycling with your strength training. However, let's jump straight into a meta-analysis that looked at training studies that compared concurrent training with just an endurance stimulus or strength training alone. So similar to what you've seen 2 slides before with that study from the early 80s, but not just one study of those, but multiple, similar to what Gommaar showed in his presentation just a few minutes ago. This is a summary of multiple studies. And on the y-axis, you see the effect size. Down here, you see the description of what they looked at. And what they saw is that indeed, when you do when you do concurrent training with running and resistance exercise, you see less of an increase in lower body hypertrophy, less increase in lower body strength compared to strength training alone regime. So this is just strength training. This is the running regime. This is a running plus strength training, I should say. This is the cycling plus strength training regime. And what you can see is, like, interestingly, For strength, it doesn't seem to matter, for example, which type of concurrent training you do, whether you do, for example, something that is more power emphasizing, like cycling, or something that is more economical, like running, and combine this with strength training. For strength, it's just seemed to be inhibitory if you do concurrent training compared to just strength. For muscle growth, I think in a little bit more.
Sorry,
oh yeah,
just to ask in there. So it's not statistically significant, the difference between the cycling and the running. Both of those didn't have, or they, wouldn't be considered to be running is better or cycling is better combined.
I would say that it's definitely not the case for strength. So for strength, it doesn't seem to matter which mode of exercise you choose in addition to your strength training if you do concurrent training. I would say for lower body hypertrophy, there seems to be a little bit of a tendency. It's not statistically significant here, so we can conclude already that the effect wouldn't be big. But still on the data, I would presume that an exercise mode that is a little more on the power reliant side of things is probably a little better for muscle growth. Now, for power, we can see that power output is not significantly different between any of those groups. So you can still increase power in your lower body, which could be assessed by, for example, a cycling test or something like that. A Wingate test is something that exercise physiologists use a lot. And it doesn't differ between the strength only or the concurrent training groups. Also, interestingly and importantly, if you do only strength training and you look at the VO2 max, then the strength training does not increase your VO2 max, whereas both the concurrent training types do increase your VO2 max. So that would be your maximal oxygen consumption, which is a good indicator for your ability of aerobic capacity or endurance capacity. So what we can take from this is essentially that strength training alone would be more efficient than concurrent training for lower body hypertrophy and strength, but also comes at the expense of not increasing your VO2 max, which is obviously a very important indicator of fitness for those people of us who are not just interested in strength, but also interested in general fitness. So if you want the best of both worlds, I would say that concurrent training may decrease your strength training gains a little bit here, but offers this huge benefit here on side of the VO2 max, and would be a more comprehensive stimulus overall for your whole body fitness, but not so much for strength and hypertrophy. And we know that, interestingly, the effect of, as you can see here, right? So if I combine strength training with cycling or with running, my VO2 max doesn't decrease, right? So I still have a great stimulus here, even though I add in strength training, whereas with the other side of things, I do see a blunted effect of the strength training on the other side, right? Well, if I add in, sorry, that was confusing, I think. What I was trying to say is, if you combine strength training with an endurance type of stimulus, you do not really see a decrease in adaptations on the endurance side of things, whereas on the strength training side of things, having an additional endurance stimulus seems to be somewhat inhibitory. Okay, we know that this is the case because mTORC, this protein that I mentioned earlier, which is key in facilitating cell growth and muscle growth and protein synthesis, is also having a positive effect on mitochondrial biogenesis. So we know that mTORC is also controlling endurance adaptations, which is why strength training, in addition to endurance training, does not inhibit the endurance adaptations so much, whereas endurance training, on the other hand, seems to impair our strength training adaptations to a certain extent. Hope that makes sense. It's a little bit confusing going back and forth about these things, but I'll have another interesting meta-analysis here to maybe give a little more insight into practical applications here and order of exercise during training. And this meta-analysis looked at the change in this is strength and this is VO2 max based on the order of exercise during concurrent training. So this is just concurrent training. And the question, did we do endurance training first or did we do strength training first? Right? Because that's obviously for our subscribers also an interesting question, I think. If I combined both, and if I didn't just do strength or endurance training, but I do both, and that's the case for most CrossFitters, I would say. Does it matter whether I have my Metcon first or my aerobic capacity session first, or my back squatting last, or the other way around? I think most classes, at least, do the strength part first. And what this meta-analysis here shows is that this would be the smarter decision to make, because across those studies that they looked at here, strength training first seemed to result in favorable results in terms of strength adaptations, but also in terms of endurance adaptations. And this is not a very strong effect here for endurance. So I would say that for endurance, it doesn't really seem to matter that much. But if you want to increase your strength with your concurrent training, I would probably always do the strength part first and do it while you're fresh and while you can, exert a certain intensity during your strength training.
Gommaar,
Finally, sorry.
Gommaar, did you want to say something on that?
I wanted to kind of say something about this, but you said it. So just a question about why this could be. This is of course very interesting and very important for CrossFitters, I would say.
Yeah.
So you think, or did you ever read somewhere that people think it's because of the fact that you can just do more reps and just do more reps at very high percentages because you are fresh, or is it just they have no clue and this is what we found?
I think that's an interesting question. There's some contradictory evidence out there. Some studies, particularly from Sweden, didn't really found a huge effect as long as the intensity of the endurance training was relatively high anyways. So if you do more high intensity interval training type stuff with your endurance, then the inhibitory effect towards strength training doesn't seem to be that big anyways. And I think in that case, I would also think that order doesn't matter that much. But if we look at classic endurance aerobic exercise kind of training where you sit on the bike for an hour or something like that at a constant intensity, then I would deduce based on what is out there that yes, the fact that you just inhibited your or not only inhibited your strength capacity, but just like straight out depleted your glycogen and are just on the lower fuel side of things, that this would decrease your ability to perform as many reps as you would usually do and exert such a stimulus. But maybe you've read more on that.
Yeah, no, not really, but it has to be something with glycogen, because it's shown that that with resistance training, there's also a strong depletion of glycogen just by doing whatever 5 times 8 reps. So I would assume if you have less glycogen because of endurance training, that you cannot recruit the type 2, the fast twitch fibers at the end of your resistance training sets, and therefore you have slightly less effect compared to when doing it fresh. So it must be
Yeah, I would think so. And we know that load across the muscles, so the question of how intense the stimulus is based on the loading of the muscle is key for activating all those pathways and muscle remodeling and growth. And if you can put up less weight, if you can put up less reps, I would think it's a fair conclusion to make that this is probably what drives down the effect of the training there.
Yep.
Okay, so just to conclude there, in untrained individuals, whether you do concurrent training or resistance training alone or endurance training alone, doesn't really seem to matter very much for aerobic endurance or hypertrophy strength adaptation. So what this bar here means, and you see that it's the same between concurrent training and resistance training and concurrent training and endurance training, is that for untrained individuals, you can totally combine both, and it probably doesn't matter as much for neither of the adaptations on both sides. So you would probably be better off by just doing concurrent training because you get the best of both worlds. Now, in trained individuals, it does look a little different. And while concurrent training is still able to probably get you just as good as an endurance training adaptation over time compared to just endurance training, for strength training adaptations, it seems that concurrent training at some point starts to slightly diminish your pure strength training gains. And I think that this is probably something that does not only go back to the pure molecular signaling of the endurance exercise in conjunction with the resistance training, but it's also at some point presumably a matter of volume and the ability of, as an advanced athlete, you obviously need a very high intensity and also relatively high volume to still continue to make progress in your training and with your numbers. And at some point, it's just difficult to fit both into your week, right? And to still pay justice, so to say, to both ends of the spectrum. And you will probably have to focus a little more on the strength things if you want to continue to make gains there. Whereas again, for endurance training, it doesn't seem to matter as much if you continue to do your resistance exercise. And this is just a little outline of what I just said a second ago. Basically, with concurrent training over the months and years, the more advanced you are as an athlete, the more concurrent training will probably diminish your ultimate development in one or the other direction. But I think this is something that makes sense to physiologists and to coaches alike, because you know that there's a lot of effort involved in maximizing the potential of an athlete in terms of endurance, just as much as in terms of resistance exercise. So over time, if you want to compete in a certain sport, for example, it's probably not advisable to continue to do concurrent training for the entirety of the season at least. But again, for beginners and for most athletes, you get the best of both worlds if you do concurrent training. And yeah, I think with this, I would like to conclude this little mini talk. Any questions, John?
I had one question, but John, go ahead.
Or Gommaar.
I think it's really nice when the evidence kind of shows what we do see in practice. It is one of those things. Actually, something for us when we're working with athletes is we don't want to see an athlete go too far in one direction, that their strength gains get so high, because what we tend to see is it has a negative effect on the other areas. And the athletes that I'm speaking about here are on that advanced end of the spectrum. Whereas the kind of classic thing with a beginner, in essence, no matter what you do, as long as they're consistent, they will improve. It's only when you get to that elite end that actually you start to notice, okay, their strength numbers are going up, but their endurance is going down, and you start kind of having to tweak those dials. So it's really nice to see it kind of in that. I like the graph at the end, representation of kind of the months into years, because that's what we tend to see as well. Yeah.
No, I think I would fully agree with that, and I think that's also something that has been around for a while, and that's also sort of intuitive, as you said. I think also Froning had a quote like that a couple of years ago, where he said in his documentary that he doesn't want his VO2 to go too high to diminish his strength, and the other way around. And I mean, those things are obviously a little bit of an oversimplification from a biological point of view, but overall, it still applies, right? If you train too much into one direction, and this probably comes with benefits in that direction, you will see a little bit of an impaired effect on the other side of the spectrum. And yeah, I think Gommaar, you were also saying something.
Yeah, no, just the next two, one of the last slides. So the next to last slide, you showed that if you are So it's interesting. So if you are, for example, a strong athlete and you want to build on your, build your engine, you want to increase your aerobic endurance, then it actually makes sense to keep doing strength training at a relatively high level while doing, of course, more endurance training, right? Because at least to most of the science showing that the strength training per se doesn't really interfere that much with the aerobic capacity, while it is actually true the other way around. So I mean, it's a bit oversimplified, but it could be interesting for strength trained athletes that are usually pretty afraid of doing any aerobic endurance, at least at the high level for sure, to just to that the science shows that you can actually build your engine on a strength training program.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really interesting part also specifically for endurance athletes, I think, to see that. I mean, you said that strength training athletes are afraid to do too much cardio. I think that's very, very prevalent among all those those enthusiastic about strength training. But the other way around is maybe also true to a certain extent, that a lot of runners and a lot of cyclists probably don't spend an awful lot of time in the weight room. Whereas I think we now know, and it's also finding its way more and more into the training of pro athletes and stuff like that. We now know that actually doing your resistance exercise, even though you're an endurance athlete, is probably beneficial, not only for your training, or it doesn't seem to inhibit your training at least, but we know that for things like bone density and things like that, and we know cyclists, when they fall, they tend to break stuff all the time, and you get connective tissue injuries in a lot of athletes with running. So things like that, I think their strength training can be really beneficial, and that's also one of the main takeaways there. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know if you've looked at this much, but this is actually one area we've been looking into more and more, and it's the differences between male and female athletes, and in essence the effects that can have, both in terms of, one, should they be doing anything different training wise, and two, can they expect to see different results?
Yeah, absolutely. Let me just pull up my my slides for that real quick and then share them with you guys. I don't know how much I will be able to comment from an applied point of view, whether people really should train differently. I think that's a super interesting question. I'm afraid that this is something that only recently started to gain a little more attention in the world of exercise physiology. So things such as, how do you, for example, schedule your training with essentially menstrual fluctuations and things like that, and I think that's really.
So as a bit of background, we obviously work with a lot of high-level female CrossFit athletes, and I think it's a bit of a taboo subject, talking about your period, menstruation, your menstrual cycle, and it's always been something that the female athletes feel they should just hide. And it's also been something, how do you, because it's a bit of a taboo subject, how do you approach this with a female athlete?
Yeah.
And with more experience, you start to see now actually how much of a significant effect it does have. One, on training, and two, also during competitions. We would almost look at not scheduling in a competition if we know that an athlete is going to be on their period during that competition. Yeah. And so we've now begun looking at different ways we can maybe manage this. What is the most optimal way? Should someone be on the contraceptive pill? Is there some form of device that works better, etc., or to manage it naturally? through this. So it's kind of a subject, I think, that, as you say, is getting more and more mainstream, and I think just so crucial for coaches and female athletes to start opening up about and talking about, because the effects we notice are actually like real, from like kind of a significant from a coach's standpoint as opposed to an evidence-based standpoint. But we know that that is something we really have to be careful with.
Yeah, no, I think it's huge. It's huge. I think talk about something like strength training adaptations, which is what I'll do in just a minute. I think there is relatively clear evidence that, in the greater scheme of things, again, shows that men and women, in terms of how they respond to resistance exercise, aren't that different per se, right? In terms of how much can you increase strength, how much can you increase your muscle mass and things like that, based on just that time window where you where you followed an intervention. But obviously there are still huge differences between men and women biologically that have to be taken into account and have to be appreciated by the athlete, but also the coach, right? So maybe it's a good disclaimer to say that what I'll say in a minute is more about appreciating differences than it is about pretending that they would be all the same, right? There are certain things that obviously men and women overlap quite substantially in terms of exercise physiology, but there's also things that where they differ, and it might not be as relevant on a recreational level, but I do think that for professional athletes, such as the ones that you work with, it's certainly something that is super important. All right, let me kick this off by saying that obviously the idea that there would be sex differences is something that is super deeply embedded into our culture, and it's not just something that was brought up overnight, but the idea that men and women are different is super old. And obviously from a biological point of view they are, but the question that we would like to ask is, from an exercise physiological point of view, how much are they really different? And does this mean that this has an impact on my training results, for example, right, as you outlined? And well, it is true, as I said before, that on average, men have more muscle mass than women and are just the bigger animal, so to say, right? So there is a difference between men and women in terms of how much muscle mass they carry across lifetime. And this is also true not only in total muscle mass, but also in relative muscle mass, in relation to their body height. So there is a baseline biological difference between men and women. Now, what is this difference based on is mostly something that we can actually find during developmental years and teenage years, right? So if I look at the curves on the left here, those are percentiles, right? So don't mind the 95. Could you look at each of those curves individually? But what is really important is that you see that the staggered line and the straight lines are really almost the same and overlapping a lot until the age of about 14, I would say, right? This is where boys become heavier than girls. And this is, what underlies what I just showed you on the previous slide, the fact that boys have more muscle mass once they become men, and that, this is something that goes back to eventually developmental years here. So this is, again, same for the first 15 years of their life or 30 years of their life. And then when we know when men or boys start to hit puberty and when they start to have higher levels of androgenic sex hormones, that's when men start or boys start to become heavier and also start to develop more muscle mass. So this is here on the right. This is just body weight on the left. This is lean body mass or skeletal muscle mass on the right. You can see here the upper graph, boys, they have around 5 kilo muscle mass when they're 5 years old. And, you know, around 13, that would still be around 15 kilograms, right? If we go down to the girls chart, you see that around 5 years old, same thing, around 5 kilo muscle mass. When they're 13, also, you know, maybe a little less than 15, between 10 and 15, that's where it starts to differ. And that's where most boys start to hit puberty, between 13 and 15 years. But at the age of 17, 18, 19, you see that the boys on average have something like 25 kilograms of muscle mass, whereas the women at the end of their development, they were more in the range of 15 to 20, right? So this is what causes the different baseline levels of fully developed men and women. So if we talk about fully developed, I mean fully developed after developmental growth. So in the age of, you know, 19, 20, that's where growth starts to stop, and where those aspects of developmental growth don't really play such a major role anymore. And by saying this, I'm already giving the ability of men and women to strength training, because what you see here is, so on the x-axis, you can see this is the graph for men, this is the graph for females, this is the graph for a control group, male, female control, etc. This is elbow extension, this is elbow flexion, this is knee flexion, this is knee extension. So these are all measures of either upper body strength or lower body strength. And what you see here is that the arm strength in those men is a lot higher. It's about 30 kilograms of elbow extension. That's what the men were on average able to exert here. Whereas for women, it's more in the range of maybe 18 to 20 kilograms, right? But after 16 weeks of resistance exercise, the men increase from 30-something kilograms to 40-something kilograms, whereas the women increase from 18 to 25 or so, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that across the board, it's true for elbow extension, it's true for elbow flexion, it's true for knee flexion and knee extension. So upper body and lower body strength increases to a similar or almost equal extent in women than it does in men. So the strength training adaptations, they have a similar amplitude of size. It's just that the baseline level after developmental growth is lower in women than in men. And this is why eventually male athletes are able athletes, population here, but if you take that baseline and if you train upon that baseline and, you know, make your curve up here through continuous resistance exercise, men will always have slightly higher strength values than women, but that's only because they have a higher baseline, more so than it is than it would be their ability to adapt to the exercise per se. Hey. Mara, I think you wanted to say something.
Yep, I want to say something. So this reiterates also a little bit what we said before, is that it looks like that really intrinsic effects of resistance training, of contracting the muscle, do affect the muscle mass gains, right? So it is maybe not, as you just said, hormones or what I know, amino acids that are circulating more or less, whatever, in men or women. It is really the fact that if you contract the muscle to exhaustion, that therefore different molecular factors are getting triggered. There's more protein synthesis, and that affects the muscle mass gain and also strength. And that's what people really should understand from this slide, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And it's not only true for strength, but it's also true for muscle growth. That's also always a question that, you know, people come up with, and is a bit of an ambiguous topic because on one hand, you have the fraction of people who are who want to empower women and want to say, look, women are just as good as something, or can be just as strong as men, which is true to this extent. But you also have a fraction of people who are afraid of muscle growth, right? Especially on the female side of things. I don't want to become too big. I don't want to become too buff, et cetera, et cetera. So by saying that women are able to grow muscle just as much as men, I don't know whether we do people a favor necessarily, but I think we do. I think it's a great thing, of course, eventually. But and I think it's also important to remember that by growing muscle, you're not automatically becoming looking like Arnold Schwarzenegger, but you just increasing your personal frame, your personal abilities, and your personal size. Doesn't mean you look like a bodybuilder, but to that extent, it's important to understand that, again, females have a lower baseline of upper body muscle mass, but with strength training, they can increase their muscle mass by a similar delta, by a similar change compared to men. Again, different baseline values, but similar relative increases with resistance exercise. And now it's also interesting to see that with thigh muscle area, that effect is not as pronounced, but the men in that study didn't show a significant increase, and so didn't the women. But I would argue that the relative increase here is still similar to the relative increase here. Okay, so what to take away from this? Women can build muscle, no question. Women can become strong, and women can also become stronger if they continue to train, and if they continue to build muscle mass, they can become stronger and be more muscular than a regular average male person. If the male, however, trains to the same extent, and also is an athlete, on average, the male will still be slightly bigger, will be slightly stronger, et cetera, et cetera. But, from a public point of view, so to say, it's easy to see that the top athletes among the CrossFit community on the female side of things are obviously a lot stronger and a lot fitter and all than the average that you would find on the street, right? And it's just of the fact that our human bodies are so adaptable to exercise that you can overcome the barriers of average population values, and you can become something else that goes beyond that, so to say. And yeah, with this, I think I would like to finish that little brief talk here. Any questions? I think Gommaar has something up his sleeve there.
John?
No, I think it's I think it is a nice summary, and again fits in with what a logical conclusion based off the evidence and what we tend to see. One thing I think CrossFit does is take away your ego of being beaten by females. So over the years, my ego has been reduced in that regard.
Yeah, no, I mean it's interesting to see, right? Because if I'm now saying women can become stronger than the average dude, I mean that's maybe a little misleading and maybe a little disrespectful, because I mean just now some of the strongest females out squatted me, right? And I've been doing this stuff for 10 years and have been doing strength training for much longer than 10 years now. So the top of the crop will be much more, as I said, than just a little better than the average dude. They will be also better than most very fit dudes. But that being said, if you look at it from a sheer plain biological point of view, in terms of the baseline and in terms of the ceiling of people, then yes, if we look at most athletic endeavors and it's going in track and field, swimming or stuff like that, then you will see that on average, male athletes on the top will still be faster and stronger than female athletes on the top. But again, the female top athletes are still crazy, exceptional athletes that will run and out throw and outlift most of the even fitter dudes.
It's maybe interesting to note that actually on the other side of the spectrum, if you look at the endurance exercise, that there are some events like ultra endurance events, the 50 mile or the 100-mile runs, that actually women outperform men. So that's maybe an interesting physiological thing that we'd have to look into, and also from a research point of view, it's very interesting that actually some females win also men competitions in the extreme ultra events, not marathon but like triple marathons. So yeah.
No, I think that's a really cool something, and as you said, it alludes a little to the fact that maybe on the far endurance end, our bodies are more similar than they are maybe on the strength side of things. So like going a little back to the idea of concurrent training and strength versus endurance, and where on that spectrum are we? And I would agree, and I think there have been speculations over time that also for marathon running, the female top time will come closer to the male top time. That wasn't really the case over the last couple of years. So as you said, I think it's probably even further than just the marathon, which is like 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah.
And maybe more of a 6-hour kind of effort there. But yeah, I think men and women are very similar overall in general, but maybe they're more so on the endurance side of things than they are on the strength side of things.
Okay, well, I'm thinking that is a good place to wrap things up. Unless any of you guys would like to go further. Oh, Gommaar, I think you're muted.
Sorry, yeah, I know. So we had one more about tapering, right?
We did have tapering for competition, which we can do if you'd like to. Who had the tapering?
I had the tapering. That would be the last one. We could do it now, right?
Okay. Yeah. So this is and I think this is an important point, is how you taper for a competition. I think in this instance is, obviously as we go through this program, we are going to then want to come into a tapering phase so we can perform our best and see truly where our strength gains are. And so again, it's following what is the evidence that leads us to an optimal taper.
Yeah, so I will talk a little bit about some theory, but I'm sure that John can also tell us a little bit more on how he does it, or at least some parts with his athletes. So let me just share quickly. So so tapering is also a pretty well-researched subject, and I will just go over some of the principles and how we can apply these principles to training and in our tapering process. So basically, you have 3 types of tapering. You have step tapering, so that means that in the weeks or the days before the actual competition, so this is days of taper, so days before the competition, so this is 14 days, and then when the competition actually is, you just reduce the total amount of training load. So this is training load, so this means actually volume times intensity, and you just decrease it by 50, 60, 70%, and then you keep it for a couple of days. But you could also linearly decrease, where you actually decrease your training load every day. And then exponentially, where you initially really decrease quickly, and then after when the actual competition comes, you start the decrease in training load, and exertion on the body is actually decreased over time. So you have, let's say, the exponential taper, fast and slow, and then step taper, and also linear taper. And differences between those tapers are pretty well established and also researched. Just maybe I can also explain and how you could taper, or how you could decrease exertion on your body. Could be by decreasing the duration of the training, so let's say the volume, the hours you train. This would be the most obvious one. But you could also decrease intensity. So instead of going all out on the Metcon, you just go easy or easier. You train less times per day or per week, and you also change up the type of exercise. So, for example, in CrossFit, you would do less of impact forceful exercises, such as whatever snatch or GTH sit-ups. You incorporate more cycling and some easier, let's say, types or modalities of training. That could also be very important for CrossFitters. So, what is the increase in performance you could expect? So this is an endurance paper about endurance, different endurance types of sports, and you can see here that most of the people increase their performance after a period of training by 2 to 6%. So that's very substantial, and again, well established. Many papers have shown a 2 to 6% increase because of the super compensation, because you feel fresher, you feel ready, and all the systems are, let's say, loaded.
So just to jump in there, because obviously the kind of term gets thrown around, the super compensation. It's kind of like, and I think that people understand the idea behind it, but from a scientific point, what is the super compensation?
Yeah, so super compensation is mostly used in terms of glycogen super compensation. So glycogen is basically glucose that is stored in the muscles and in the liver. And during CrossFit competitions, it is mainly glycogen you use as an energy source. So during high power output exercises, you use glycogen. So it's imperative to have a lot of glycogen available, and certainly during, for example, a 2 to 3 day competition where you have multiple workouts next to each other. So what you could do in that case is, for example, do a relatively hard training 5 to 6 days before a competition, where you deplete your glycogen in the muscle and also in the liver, and then for the next 3 to 4 days eat higher than normal amount of carbohydrates. So you super compensate in that way the amount of glycogen that is sitting into in the muscle, mostly in the muscles, also slightly in the liver, and that is what most endurance athletes, and I hope at least also some CrossFit athletes use as a performance benefit. In other super compensation, it's a little bit more tricky to point one specific thing that why super compensation by tapering actually has a performance effect. I think it's a combination of mental effects, biological effects, glycogen super compensation, just release of fatigue, all these things together, I would say.
Just a question on regarding the glycogen.
Yes.
Is it not possible? So say, for example, are you not able to fully replenish all your glycogen stores a lot sooner than that? So, for example, within a day, within 24 hours?
Yes. Yeah, certainly well-trained athletes can after, let's say, after a very hard training session, like a long, hard training session where they're fully depleted, or at least pretty well depleted, they can resynthesize their glycogen within 24 hours. That's also what Tour de France cyclists, for example, have to do. Otherwise, they cannot finish the stage. But if you want to super compensate, you need a little bit more time. And also you need really a lot of carbohydrates. We're speaking about 8 to 10 grams per kilogram per day. That's you have to calculate that. That is, at least that's what some studies show. That is more than most people eat. So yes, in terms of super compensation, you probably need a little bit more than 24 hours. So what is actually the most important? So what has the biggest effect from a coaching point of view? I think that's important, right? So what do I have to decrease? Do I have to decrease volume, intensity, frequency, type of taper, pattern of taper? So this is a table from again from a meta-analysis. I was just gonna take my laser pointer here, and it showed the effect size of certain things you could do during your taper. And it shows here, for example, if you decrease your training volume, so purely the hours you train, by more than 40%, this had a huge effect on performance. So the higher this effect size is, the larger the effect of the parameter, in this case, training volume. So that is something you definitely should do, decreasing the volume, I would say. Intensity, interesting enough, it didn't have any effect. Actually, on the contrary, it would be better to not decrease training intensity. That would have the largest effect in performance after tapering. For example, I talk sometimes with Lucas Esslinger, 4 times Games athlete, CrossFit Games athlete, and also well known in the sport related to how he tackles training. And he always says that he keeps the intensity high during his taper. So he decreases the volume, but he keeps the intensity high. For him, that works well. And at least to many studies, this actually seems to be a good strategy to keep the intensity high. The duration of the taper, it doesn't really matter, but what is usually done is a little bit more than 7 days, right? So this is for, again, big competitions. This is a very long, so longer than 22 days taper. That's for most athletes a bit too long, but I mean, it has to be here. The biggest effect sizes are more than 7 days. And interesting enough, the pattern of the taper, so how you do it, a step taper or progressive taper, it doesn't really matter. Whatever is the easiest for you, or for your coach to implement. So that's maybe also important to notice. Actually, a step taper, so just where you every couple of days you decrease your training volume, would be the easiest, or at least having the biggest effect. So yeah, so this is just we talked about endurance training mostly, but actually tapering for example, powerlifting or resistance training also works really well. So this is just showing one study, but there's many showing that they did 16 weeks of full body resistance training, and then they had a control group that didn't do any resistance training, or they had a tapering group where 4 weeks before the end of before the end of the training, they started tapering. And then they also had a detraining group where actually during instead of tapering, so just decreasing the volume, they just completely stopped training. And you can see here that the tapering group, so this is it's a little bit complicated with this T0, T1, and T2, but importantly here is that from T1 and in between T1 and T2, this was the tapering or detraining. You can see when they tapered, they kept their let's say the strength, their bench press from after training to after tapering. While if they just detrained or didn't do anything, there was a quite substantial decrease in bench press strength in these resistance trained people. So this shows that also tapering for powerlifters, so pure 1RM strength, could also have some beneficial effects here. The control group, of course, had no effect of strength training or tapering. Yeah, and then just also to have a little bit of an overlook on how or how much different studies related to powerlifting or strength training have played with this tapering. And you can see here that some studies used step tapering, some used exponential, and then they usually, this is the back squat 1RM or the bench press 1RM. You can see most of these studies showed a 2 to 6% increase after tapering in strength in back squat, but also in bench press. So it really seems to have a quite substantial effect, this tapering period. So if you're competitive or you have a competition somewhere in the next months, it might make sense to taper off before the actual competition starts. And this is just the last table, just an overview for you. So what actually matters and what is recommended by, at least by research, and also it makes intuitive sense, I think, is what type of taper, step or progressive, or it doesn't really matter. What helps or what was easiest for you as an athlete and as a coach seems to be the best. Length at least 1 week, could be up to 4 weeks if you really want to push it. Volume decrease by at least 30%, as we said. Intensity maintain or slightly increase even. That's interesting. So many people think they also have to decrease the intensity, but that doesn't seem to be the case. And the frequency maintain or reduce to attain the volume reduction. So of course, if you want to decrease your volume, you probably also have to decrease your training frequency. So I think that's a general recommendation. And as I said, tapering is a very good strategy to improve performance during competition.
I think it's, again, a very nice summary. I actually think we had a conversation once, or you put out a statement. There was a significant athlete who stated they weren't going to taper before a competition with devastating effects. So I think we all, it is almost criminal if people aren't tapering in some way, shape, or form before, especially before a CrossFit competition.
Yeah, certainly CrossFit. I mean, if you're talking about cycling or so, where it's not really an impactful sport, but I mean CrossFit, where we also have to really push the limits related to strength exercises, it doesn't make any sense to not taper substantially, even for any competition.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, it's maybe you can get away with it for like a one event online. I mean, obviously related to CrossFit now, but a one event online qualifier or something like that. But yes, it's just, of
course, depending on how important the
be it the physiological, biological impact, but as well just the mental stress for an athlete going into an all-day competition, having to maintain the same level of volume and same level of intensity with that volume would just be, it's just very hard to do, really.
Yeah, exactly.
And no reason, there's no reason.
No, because I think why some people don't really taper is because they think they would lose the gains, right? They would lose it, but it's also really.
I laugh at this, but actually, it's actually, especially with new athletes who are coming on board, you would be surprised at how much we get that question that people are just so scared of losing their gains. And, you're almost in this like, not argument, but this discussion where you're like, just have a little faith that you are going to be fine during this period. But
there's some studies showing that during progressive resistance training, that if you have periods of 2 to 3 weeks where you don't train so let's say you have a 15-week training period, resistance training, basic resistance training, and one group just progressively always increase the weights and the loads, but another group had some periods of 2 to 3 weeks where they didn't train, zero training, and then they picked up the weights again. At the end of the 15 weeks or 16 weeks, they had the same amount of strength gains. So it's just not true that if you don't train or at least decrease your training for 1 or 2 weeks, that you would lose everything. This is not scientifically proven, at least.
Did you have anything to add in there, Henning?
Yeah, just maybe that I think this is something that goes back to what we talked about earlier, right? The tendency of CrossFit athletes, specifically more so than just maybe the recreational CrossFitter, to do maybe a little too much rather than too little at certain instances. And this goes a long way, of course, for the endurance adaptations, because whatever you do is probably going to help your endurance adaptations in the long run, to a certain extent at least. But if it goes, more to the strength power side of things, I think being well recovered is so essential. And I mean, even I personally have been there, you know, during my powerlifting days in the past, but also CrossFit competitions, just like not doing something or not training as heavily or with as much volume, at least over the last week leading into something, at the same time eating to make sure that your stores are fully replenished by the time you're trying to hit new numbers or you're exposed to the WODs and lifts in the competition. It's just, I would say, makes almost five to almost maybe not 10% difference, but a 5% difference in just like sheer strength numbers or high power output over a short period of time. And I think that if you were looking at, for example, the other side of the spectrum again, and you would have them run for an hour, probably the effect wouldn't quite be as pronounced to do your tapering, because there's also a lot of psychological and readiness and stuff like that involved with the pure aerobic capacity events. But yeah, I think for strength, it's huge. I'm always baffled if people underestimate the effect of tapering and of replenishing glycogen, refeeding glycogen the days leading up to a competition, especially in a competition like CrossFit where there's no weight limits, right? If you're starting in like Olympic weightlifting and you got to make sure you make your weight class or stuff like that, it's a little trickier to do the whole refeeding and loading on carbs and stuff like that. But if all that's asked for you, all I'm saying, because it's obviously super intense and exhausting, but if all that's asked of you is to show up in whatever shape or form, then yeah, make sure you're loaded to the max with your glycogen, you're fresh, and every intense exercise session is obviously diminishing the glycogen stores again. So that's also one of the important aspects there, not just the training and the tapering per se, but eating. You basically, if you train less and the volume is lower, your calorie output goes down a little bit over the week. At the same time, if you just eat constantly, you will be in a slight surplus compared to your usual training, and you will be able to refill your stores. And I think that's also a big part of the whole tapering, to make sure that you have sufficient energy supply. Yeah, Gommaar.
Yeah, I agree. Nothing to say about that.
Okay.
Okay, so I think that is, especially for the listeners and subscribers who have made it this far, it's definitely like a lot of knowledge to take away. We will be following this up. I think we'll be following it up with some kind of quick fire questions as well for the listeners who have less of an attention span and but still like to get the knowledge. We will be putting all links, everything, information below, and we'll be putting all the contact details for everyone. So if people want to reach out with specific questions or kind of follow along, they can do so there. But it was great speaking with you guys.
Yeah, thanks for the questions, John, and appreciate the collaboration there.
Yep.